She was slowly pushed out of church life after marrying a black man. They never imagined he'd be the reason their sanctuary stayed standing. They whispered behind her back every Sunday, not loud enough to be heard by the pastor, not crude enough to be called out, but loud enough to sting. It was the same every week. Smiles on the surface, side glances beneath. Hollow, "How are yous?" followed by hushed judgment as soon as she turned her back. Renee, a graceful woman in her early 30s with soft brown skin, warm eyes, and a calm, dignified air, stood alone by the edge of the courtyard. The sunlight hit the side of her face as she sipped from a small paper cup of church punch, pretending not to notice. She always pretended. After service, the congregation spilled into the courtyard like they always did, families greeting each other, children running under the azaleas, church ladies comparing casseroles. Should have been warm, comforting, familiar. But for Renee, it hadn't felt that way in years. Not since she married Andre. Andre wasn't there that Sunday. He usually wasn't. Not because he lacked faith, far from it, but because faith and fellowship had been two very different things in this building. Tall, kind-eyed, and quiet by nature, Andre had shown up after they were first married. He had worn a pressed shirt, carried himself with respect, and extended his hand with sincerity. But they hadn't seen Andre. They had seen his skin first. There had been no slurs, of course. No open rejection. Just a soft shift in energy. A polite discomfort. Invitations to small groups stopped coming. Conversations moved on quickly when he tried to join in. Eyes lingered too long, then looked away. After 3 Sundays, he asked her, "Do they know I can hear them?" Renee had smiled sadly and replied, "They don't think you matter enough to whisper quieter." So he stopped coming. And she kept going, because Renee believed in holding on, to her faith, to her community, even if that community had slowly placed her at arm's length. On that particular Sunday, the breeze was soft. The hymn still lingered in the air, clinging to the stained glass windows behind them. Renee stood with her hands folded in front of her, watching the church ladies near the fellowship table. They weren't trying to be quiet. Not really. She used to help with choir every month, one woman said, loading cookies onto a napkin. She changed after marrying him, another added. She used to be one of us. Renee didn't turn around. Her jaw tightened slightly, but her face remained gentle. She took another sip of punch and stared at the rose bushes. They didn't hate her. That's what made it harder. They thought they were being careful, respectful even. They hadn't exiled her. They just slowly made space where she used to be. In Bible study, they asked for prayers, but never hers. At potlucks, her name was last on the sign-up sheet, if written at all. No one said she didn't belong. They just stopped treating her like she did, and still she showed up. Week after week, hair pulled back neatly, dress modest and lovely, smile always in place. Because Renee wasn't there for them, she was there for something higher, something that couldn't be stained by whispered words or withheld invitations. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Behind her, the voices faded. New ones took their place. Talk of football, of the weather, of the church roof fundraiser. That still hadn't reached its goal. Maybe if we had more committed members, someone said. Renee exhaled through her nose just once. Then slowly she set her cup down and began walking toward her car. She didn't cry. She never cried. Not for them, because she had something, someone, worth far more than their approval. And what they didn't know was that the man they whispered about, he was about to become the reason this church kept standing. Renee and Andre lived a peaceful, modest life. Their home wasn't large, but it was filled with light. The kitchen smelled like fresh basil on Sundays. Their living room, small but cozy, always had jazz humming softly from a speaker Andre had rewired himself. Books lined the shelves, candles burned low at night, and love, quiet, unshakable love, filled the spaces in between. Andre worked from home most days. He was a tech consultant, the kind who didn't talk much about what he did, but always seemed to know how to fix things no one else could. He wasn't flashy. He didn't crave attention. He just did what needed doing with precision, humility, and a kind of loyalty that showed up in the little things. When Renee came home from church, Andre could read the story on her face before she even set down her keys. She would take off her shoes slowly, sometimes pause by the door like she needed to leave more than her heels behind. Then she'd walk into the kitchen, pour herself tea, and sit down without a word. He never pushed. He just waited. And finally, she would say, softly, "It's the same," whispers. Sometimes she said it with a shrug, sometimes with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but always with the same quiet ache in her voice. Andre knew what she meant. He'd seen the change from the outside, how the people who once hugged her with both arms now settled for half smiles, how the high Renees turned into polite nods, how her name started disappearing from choir rosters and potluck schedules. Flashbacks lived in his memory like old photographs. The day they were first married, standing in the church foyer. No one said congratulations. The moment Renee returned from a Wednesday night committee meeting, eyes red. They moved me off the planning list, said they restructured. The time she offered to lead the Easter program and was told someone else already had something in mind. It wasn't overt. That's what made it harder to fight. They never said, "You don't belong," they just showed her. With every missed invitation, every conversation that ended when she entered the room, every bulletin where her name was, no longer printed. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, Andre finally asked her, "Do you want to go somewhere else?" His voice was gentle. There was no bitterness in it, only concern. Renee stared out at the trees for a moment. The wind stirred the leaves, and for a second she didn't say anything. Then she shook her head. "I don't go for them," she said. "I go for my faith." Andre nodded, but his jaw tensed. He admired her strength, but it hurt to watch her carry something she didn't deserve. She never blamed the church directly, never called anyone out by name. But he could see the slow erosion of joy, the weight in her walk, the way she still showed up week after week, hoping her presence would be enough to remind them she hadn't changed, only their acceptance had. Later that month, Renee came home from another Sunday service. Her hair was still pinned, her dress neat, but her spirit sagged beneath the weight of another morning of exclusion. Andre stood at the sink, drying a coffee mug. She placed her purse on the counter and leaned against the fridge. "They're short on funds for the roof repair," she said flatly. "They've mentioned it 3 times now." Andre nodded. "They were handing out donation slips after service. Didn't hand one to me." Andre looked at her, not with anger, but with something deeper, resolve. He set down the mug, walked to where she stood, and took her hand. "Would it help?" he asked. "If they saw what love looks like in action?" Renee blinked. The question caught her off guard. "What again?" "You mean?" He smiled faintly. "I mean, maybe it's time their assumptions met reality." It was a warm Sunday, clear skies, soft breeze, the kind of day where the stained glass windows cast gentle patterns across the sanctuary floor. The service had ended not long ago. Hymnals closed, bulletins folded. The usual post-sermon buzz filled the air as people stood to stretch, fix their collars, and prepare for coffee and conversation outside. Renee stood near the back, already gathering her things, her Bible, her purse, her silence. She was used to slipping out quickly these days before the whispers started again, before the polite small talk that excluded her by omission. But then the pastor raised his hand from the pulpit. "Before you go," he said, smiling gently, "I have something special to share. A blessing, really." The room paused. "We've been praying hard for a solution to our roof repairs. You all know the fund wasn't where we needed it to be. Well, this week, that changed." He let the pause linger, letting the weight of the words sink in. "There was a donation," he continued, "a generous one, quiet, private, given with no request for recognition." The air shifted, heads turned, murmurs stirred in the pews. Someone near the front whispered, "Was it the McClures?" Another leaned toward a neighbor and shrugged, eyebrows raised. "But we reached out," the pastor said, "and convinced him to let us share. Just a name. Just enough to say, 'Thank you.'" Renee glanced up, her brow furrowed slightly. The pastor turned to face the congregation more fully. "And so today," he said, voice steady, "we give thanks for a gift that saved our church roof project in honor of Renee Williams, given by her husband, Andre." 8. Stillness fell over the room like a dropped curtain. Renee's eyes widened. She froze. It felt like the ground beneath her shifted half an inch, not in fear, but in disbelief. She hadn't known. He hadn't told her. Across the sanctuary, necks craned, eyes searched for her face. Some people blinked, others looked down. A few pressed their lips together, suddenly unsure of their own kindness. The women who once ran the event committee, who had forgotten to include Renee for months, stood like statues, clutching their handbags as if they might deflect the guilt curling in their chests. Someone near the side aisle whispered, "That's her husband? He's the one who—" The realization bloomed like fire through dry grass. The man they had judged in silence. You had saved their church, and he hadn't even asked for thanks. Renee sat slowly, still gripping her Bible. Her face was composed, but her eyes shimmered. Not from embarrassment, not even from pride. It was something else. Something like vindication, without vengeance. The pastor closed the announcement with a prayer of thanks. His voice was kind, but his eyes, just briefly, glanced toward Renee, and in that glance there was apology. After the final "Amen," no one rushed out. The usual chatter was gone. Instead, they stood in soft clusters, eyes drifting toward Renee, unsure whether to say something or say nothing at all. And then, just as the murmurs began to rise again, the back doors opened, and Andre walked in. He was dressed simply, dark slacks, a crisp shirt. His presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. He walked with quiet ease toward Renee, as if this were just another Sunday, as if the room hadn't just collectively swallowed its pride. She looked up at him, her expression still unreadable. He offered a faint smile. Not smug, not grand, just warm, certain. As he reached her, a few people began to approach. The choir director came first, offering a handshake and a quiet "thank you." Then one of the church board members. Then an usher. Then Sister Elaine, the one who'd once said she used to be one of us. Elaine hesitated. We didn't expect this," she murmured. Andre nodded once. His reply was simple. "Kindness," he said, "shouldn't depend on expectation." Then he turned to Renee, reached for her hand and said softly, "Ready to go?" She nodded, and together they walked past the pews, past the whispers, past the tension that had once kept him out, and now couldn't deny him, not because he demanded respect, but because he lived in a way that made judgment look small. The sanctuary slowly emptied, but the air outside buzzed with something more than sunlight and Sunday pleasantries. The courtyard, usually filled with easy laughter and overlapping conversations, was subdued. People lingered by the lemonade table or adjusted their sunglasses as if distraction might erase discomfort. They had all heard the announcement. They had all turned to see Renee, seated with her Bible clenched just a little tighter. And now, after the final hymn had played and the last Amen had been whispered, they waited, and then he appeared. Andre. He stepped into the courtyard without ceremony. No fanfare, no dramatic timing. Just a man walking into a space that had never made room for him before. He wore a crisp light blue shirt tucked neatly into dark slacks. No tie, no watch, just calm, clean lines and an air of stillness that turned heads without trying. Renee saw him first. Her posture softened. The rest of the crowd followed slowly, like a tide shifting directions. It began with subtle glances, then hushed voices. He actually came. That's him? I didn't think he'd show up. Andre didn't flinch. He didn't rush. He walked with measured steps across the stone path, sunlight flickering through the branches above him. until he reached the edge of the crowd. And then, something remarkable happened. People approached, not in groups, not boldly, but one at a time. A deacon extended his hand with a hesitant, "Thank you." Andre nodded, shook it politely. "You're welcome." A young couple, who had never once said hello to Renee after service, offered soft smiles and shuffled off. No one knew what to say, because nothing about Andre demanded recognition, but everything about his presence commanded reflection. And then came Sister Elaine. She stood near the courtyard bench, clutching her purse like it anchored her. Her lips parted, then closed again. The woman who had once said, "Renee just doesn't fit in anymore," now struggled to find words that would fit in her own mouth. Eventually, she stepped forward. Her tone was low, uncertain. "We didn't expect this." Andre turned to her, his expression calm. No bitterness, no smirk, just the same quiet steadiness that had always been his. He gave a small smile. "Kindness," he said, "shouldn't depend on expectation." Elaine blinked. She wasn't used to being answered without shame or confrontation. Andre continued, his voice even softer now. "My wife believes in this church. That's enough for me." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned toward Renee, who was now standing, watching from a few feet away, and reached for her hand. Their fingers met like two pieces that had always belonged together. He leaned in slightly. "Ready to go?" Renee smiled. Not the forced smile she wore to survive Sunday mornings. Not the one that said, "I'm fine," when she wasn't. This one was real, free, unburdened. "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." They turned together and began walking toward the lot, through the center of the courtyard, through the sea of now silent bystanders, and not a single whisper followed them, not one. Because when someone shows you what real love looks like, what grace looks like, you stop murmuring about the color of their skin and start questioning the condition of your heart. Renee never said, "I told you so." She never needed to. That wasn't her style. And besides, the look in their eyes said more than any words ever could. The following Sunday, the church felt different. Not in a way you could point at exactly. The hymn was the same. The air smelled faintly of flowers and floor polish as usual. The choir still sang a half-step behind tempo. But there was something else, a quiet shift, and this time, when Renee walked through the front doors, she wasn't alone. Andre was with her. They didn't enter with fanfare. No grand announcement. No puffed-up pride. Just two people, hand in hand finding their pew. And no one said a word against it. No one shifted away when they sat down. No one avoided eye contact. If anything, people turned toward them. Smiled even. Renee exhaled slowly as they took their seats. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was something gentler, a release. The choir began to sing. The pastor preached his sermon, though he glanced at them more than once, each time with a subtle nod of respect, like a quiet apology woven into the message. And then came the final hymn. People stood, leafing through their bulletins. And there it was, just beneath the order of worship and the upcoming bake sale details. A new section. This week's spotlight, gratitude in action, honoring love that speaks through grace. No name was mentioned, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew who it was about. Some people shifted in their seats, unsure of how to feel. Others glanced toward Renee and Andre with something bordering admiration. Not everyone changed. That was the truth. Some still held tight to old thinking. Some would never fully admit they'd been wrong, but for once the silence wasn't heavy with judgment. It had been replaced with something else. Respect, even if reluctant, even if late. After service, Renee and Andre stood in the courtyard. This time, no one avoided them. A few people stopped to chat. One woman from the finance committee offered a muffin from a basket. Another thanked Andre for showing us what giving looks like. He nodded, warm and quiet, the same way he always had. Renee smiled but didn't gloat. She didn't have to, because the lesson had already been delivered, and not through lectures or anger or call-outs, through presence, through love, through action. They had judged him from a distance, but they couldn't deny what they saw up close, a man who gave without asking, who loved without needing to prove anything. Later that day, as they walked to their car, Andre opened the passenger door for Renee, like he always did. She looked at him for a moment before getting in, her eyes shining not with tears, but with peace. "Was it worth it?" she asked quietly. He smiled. "It was never about them." She nodded, and that was enough, because sometimes the greatest change doesn't come from shouting back. It comes from standing firm in who you are and letting grace do the rest.